In the autumn of 1882, the small Virginia town of Millhaven lay nestled in a cradle of rolling hills, where the Blue Ridge Mountains cast long shadows over fields of goldenrod and fading tobacco. The air carried the crisp bite of early frost, and the scent of wood smoke lingered from chimneys dotting the scattered farmhouses. Millhaven was a place of quiet routines, where life revolved around the rhythms of planting and harvest, and the heart of the community beat within the weathered walls of St. Augustine's Chapel. The church, a modest wooden structure with a steeply pitched roof and a single iron bell, stood at the town's center, its whitewashed exterior glowing faintly under the moonlight. To the townsfolk, it was more than a place of worship. It was a sanctuary where baptisms were celebrated, weddings solemnized, and funerals mourned. Its pews, worn smooth by generations of hands, held the stories of Millhaven's people, farmers who toiled under the sun, mothers who stitched quilts by candlelight, and children who chased fireflies in the churchyard. But beneath the chapel's creaking floorboards lay a secret, a cavernous basement that few had ever seen, its existence known only to a handful of deacons and the church's aging caretaker. This hidden space, damp and cloaked in shadow, would soon become the stage for a horror that would stain Millhaven's history forever. The town itself was unremarkable, even by the standards of rural Virginia. A single dirt road, rutted by wagon wheels, wound through the center, connecting a general store, a blacksmith's forge, and a cluster of clapboard houses. The population hovered just under 200, a close-knit community where everyone knew each other's names and secrets were hard to keep. Yet, there was an unspoken pride in Millhaven's simplicity. The people were God-fearing, their lives tethered to the land and the church. Sundays saw the chapel filled with voices raised in hymn, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and wax candles. Families like the Carters, who owned the largest farm, and the Wilsons, whose matriarch baked pies for every church social, were pillars of the community. Children played in the churchyard, their laughter mingling with the tolling of the bell, while elders swapped stories of harvest passed on the steps. The chapel was a refuge, a place where the hardships of rural life, droughts, failed crops, and the occasional fever could be surrendered to fate. No one could have imagined that this sacred space would become a tomb. The basement, though rarely spoken of, was a practical feature when the chapel was built in 1835. Designed for storage, it housed crates of hymnals, spare pews, and barrels of lamp oil. Its entrance was a trapdoor behind the altar, covered by a threadbare rug, and a narrow stone staircase descended into the dark. The air below was heavy, smelling of earth and mildew, and the walls were rough-hewn stone slick with moisture. Few ventured there, as the caretaker, old Amos Reed, handled most chores himself, grumbling about the damp that aggravated his joints. Amos, a widower with no family, was a fixture in Millhaven, his grizzled beard and stooped posture as familiar as the chapel itself. He kept the basement locked, claiming it was to prevent children from wandering where they shouldn't. Most townsfolk thought little of it. The church was for worship, not for exploring its underbelly. Yet, there were whispers, faint and easily dismissed, about strange noises at night, a low hum or the scrape of stone, heard by those who lingered after evening services. These were chalked up to the wind or the settling of an old building, but they planted seeds of unease in a few restless minds. Millhaven's isolation added to its insular nature. The nearest town was a day's ride away, and visitors were rare, mostly peddlers or circuit preachers passing through. News from the outside world arrived slowly, carried by yellowed newspapers or word of mouth. The Civil War had left its scars, widows still wore black, and fields bore the marks of old battles, but Millhaven had largely been spared direct violence. Its people clung to tradition, wary of change, and the chapel was their anchor. The pastor before Ezekiel Harrow, Reverend Thomas Grayson, had served for 30 years, a gentle man whose sermons emphasized forgiveness and community. When he died in 1879, struck down by pneumonia, the town mourned deeply. His absence left a void, and the search for a new preacher became a matter of urgency. The deacons, led by Samuel Carter, a stern but respected farmer, sought someone who could uphold the chapel's legacy. They had no idea that their choice would unravel everything they held dear. Life in Millhaven was not without its struggles. The soil was rocky, and farming was a gamble against unpredictable rains. Families like the Thompsons, who lived on the town's edge, often went hungry when crops failed. Disease was a constant threat. Diphtheria had claimed 3 children the previous winter, and the memory of their small coffins lingered. The church offered solace, a place to pray for better days. Women gathered to sew clothes for the poor, men repaired the roof after storms, and children learned their letters in Sunday school. The chapel was a symbol of endurance, its bell a call to unity. But beneath this surface of piety, there were cracks, petty jealousies, old grudges, and a growing restlessness among the younger generation, who dreamed of cities like Richmond or even far-off Chicago. These tensions were subtle, easily ignored, until the arrival of a stranger who would exploit them with devastating precision. The town's rhythm was dictated by the seasons. Autumn brought harvest festivals with tables laden with cornbread, apple cider and roasted hog. The churchyard buzzed with laughter as children bobbed for apples and men competed in feats of strength. Winter was harsher, forcing families to huddle indoors, rationing firewood and praying for spring. The chapel remained a constant, its doors open even in blizzards, offering warmth and hope. The basement, though, was a forgotten space, its existence fading into the background of daily life. Only Amos Reed, with his iron key, ever descended its steps, and even he avoided lingering. He'd once told Samuel Carter, half in jest, that the basement felt wrong, like the air itself was watching. Samuel had laughed it off, but the comment lingered, a faint warning no one heeded. The community's faith was simple but unshakable. They believed in a God who rewarded hard work and punished sin. Sermons were straightforward, drawn from familiar passages in the King James Bible. The chapel's stained glass window, a gift from a wealthy donor decades earlier, depicted Christ as the Good Shepherd, a comforting image for a people who knew hardship. Yet this faith also made them vulnerable. They trusted their leaders, from deacons to preachers, to guide them towards salvation. When Ezekiel Harrow arrived, he would wield distrust like a blade, cutting deeper than anyone could foresee. The basement, with its cold stone walls and hidden corners, waited silently, a blank canvas for the horrors to come. Millhaven's people were not naive, but they were unprepared for deception. Cloaked in piety, they had faced wolves, floods and sickness, but never a predator who spoke in scripture. The chapel, with its whitewashed walls and tolling bells, seemed impregnable, a fortress of faith. Yet beneath it, the basement lay like a buried heart, pulsing with secrets that would soon spill into the open. The town's innocence, forged in years of toil and prayer, was about to be shattered, and St. Augustine's chapel would never again be a place of peace. The stage was set, the shadows gathering, and Millhaven stood on the edge of a darkness it could not yet imagine. In the fall of 1880, a stranger arrived in Millhaven under a sky bruised with storm clouds, his presence as sudden and unsettling as the thunder that rolled over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Ezekiel Harrow was tall and gaunt, his frame draped in a black frock coat that seemed to swallow the light. His face was sharp, with cheekbones like knife edges and eyes that burned with an intensity that could silence a room. He carried a worn leather Bible, its pages dog-eared and marked with cryptic annotations, and his voice when he spoke was a low, resonant drawl that seemed to weave scripture and menace into a single threat. To the people of Millhaven, he was a figure both magnetic and unnerving, a preacher whose arrival promised to fill the void left by Reverend Grayson's death. Yet, from the moment he stepped into St. Augustine's chapel, there was something about him that felt like a shadow passing over the sun. Harrow introduced himself as a man of God, claiming to have served congregations in distant towns, places no one in Millhaven had ever heard of, like Black Hollow and Gideon's Crossing. His credentials were vague, a letter of recommendation from an obscure synod, but the deacons, led by Samuel Carter, were desperate for a new pastor. The chapel had stood empty for nearly a year, its pulpit silent, and the community was fraying without spiritual guide. Harrow's arrival seemed providential. His first sermon, delivered on a crisp October Sunday, was a masterclass in charisma. He spoke of salvation through sacrifice, of a God who demanded not just faith, but devotion poured out like blood on an altar. The congregation, accustomed to Grayson's gentle homilies, was captivated. Women clutched their hymnals, men nodded gravely, and even the children sat still, caught in the cadence of his words. By the end of the service, Millhaven was. The preacher settled into the small parsonage beside the chapel, a weathered cottage with a sagging roof and a single window facing the churchyard. He kept to himself at first, seen only when he emerged to prepare sermons or visit parishioners. His visits were deliberate, targeting the most influential families first: the Carters, the Wilsons, The Thompsons. He brought gifts of scripture, reciting verses with a fervor that made listeners feel chosen. To Mary Carter, Samuel's wife, he spoke of a divine plan that required unwavering loyalty. To young Eliza Wilson, barely 16, he whispered of a sacred role she might play in God's kingdom. His words were honeyed but laced with something darker, a promise of salvation that carried an unspoken cost. Within weeks, he had woven himself into the fabric of Millhaven, his influence spreading like ink through water. Harrow's sermons grew bolder, his rhetoric sharp. He preached of a world corrupted, of a judgment looming unless the faithful proved their worth. Blood and rebirth. He intoned, his voice rising to a fevered pitch. The currency of salvation. The phrase became a refrain, repeated in every service, its meaning opaque but intoxicating. Some, like old Amos Reed, the chapel's caretaker, found it troubling. Amos, who had polished the pews for decades, muttered to Samuel Carter that Harrow's words felt crooked, like a snake's path. But Samuel, swayed by Harrow's intensity, dismissed the old man's concerns. Others too felt unease. Martha Thompson, whose husband had fallen ill, whispered to her sister that Harrow's eyes seemed to see too much, as if he could peer into her thoughts. Yet these doubts were fleeting, drowned by the preacher's charisma and the town's hunger for guidance. By the spring of 1881, Harrow's hold on Millhaven was nearly absolute. He formed a small inner circle, a group he called the Elect, drawn from the town's most devout. They met in the chapel after hours, their gatherings cloaked in secret. Samuel Carter was among them, as was Eliza Wilson, whose parents saw her involvement as a sign of piety. The meetings were held in the church's vestry at first, but Harrow soon began speaking of a sacred space below the chapel, a place where true communion could occur. The basement, long neglected, was cleaned and prepared under his direction. Amos Reed, tasked with sweeping out the cobwebs, noticed strange markings scratched into the stone walls, symbols that looked like no scripture he knew. When he questioned Harrow, the preacher fixed him with a stare and said, "The Lord speaks in signs, Amos. You'd do well to heed them." Amos never spoke of it again. The disappearances began subtle. First was Jonah Hale, a farmer who had openly questioned Harrow's teachings during a church supper. He was last seen walking home under a harvest moon, his lantern bobbing in the dark. His wife reported him missing, but the town assumed he'd left for Richmond, as he'd often talked of doing. Then came Abigail Morse, a widow who had refused Harrow's invitation to join the Elect. Her cottage was found empty, her shawl draped over a chair as if she'd stepped out for a moment. The townsfolk whispered of runaways or accidents, but no one dared connect the dots to the preacher. Harrow offered prayers for the missing, his voice heavy with sorrow, and the congregation clung to his words like a lifeline. Fear began to creep into Millhaven, a quiet dread that settled in the pauses between hymns. Harrow's influence deepened as he exploited the town's vulnerability. He preyed on their grief, their poverty, their longing for meaning in a world of hardship. To the Thompsons, struggling after a failed harvest, he promised divine favor in exchange for loyalty. To the young, restless for purpose, he offered a vision of a new order, one where they would be exalted. His sermons grew more apocalyptic, warning of a reckoning that only the elect would survive. He began to hold private councils, inviting families to the parsonage late at night. Those who attended returned changed, quiet, fervent, their eyes carrying a strange light. Eliza Wilson stopped speaking to her friends, spending hours copying verses. Harrow gave her verses no one recognized from the Bible. Samuel Carter, once a skeptic, began quoting Harrow's phrases, his face etched with a zeal that unnerved his wife. The preacher's control was not without resistance, but it was swiftly silenced. Thomas Burke, a blacksmith who challenged Harrow during a sermon, found his forge burned to the ground days later. He left Millhaven soon after, claiming he'd seen shadows moving in the churchyard at midnight. Others who spoke out faced subtler punishments, shunning, rumors or visits from Harrow himself, whose presence could turn defiance to submission. By the winter of 1881, the town was divided. Though few admitted, there were those who worshipped Harrow, hanging on his every word, and those who felt a growing unease but lacked the courage to act. The chapel, once a place of unity,
became a fault line, its basement waiting like a trap ready to spring. Harrow's true intentions remained hidden, veiled in scripture and charisma. He spoke of a great work, a divine mission that would elevate Millhaven above all others. The elect, he said, were chosen to lead this transformation, but it required sacrifice, blood and rebirth. Always blood and rebirth. The basement, now a place of hushed reverence among his followers, was prepared for rituals no one outside the elect could fathom. Candles were placed in blackened lanterns. A stone slab was dragged to the center, and the air grew heavy with the scent of something ancient and wrong. Millhaven stood on the edge of a precipice, its people unaware that the preacher they trusted was leading them into darkness. Ezekiel Harrow had come to claim their souls, and the chapel's basement would be his altar.
By the summer of 1881, Ezekiel Harrow's grip on Millhaven had tightened into a stranglehold, his influence seeping into every corner of the small Virginia town like damp rot through timber. The church basement, once a forgotten storage space beneath St. Augustine's chapel, had transformed into a clandestine sanctum, its stone walls and earthen floor now bearing witness to rituals that twisted faith into something profane. What began as a place to store hymnals and candle wax had become the heart of Harrow's growing cult, a hidden stage where his most devoted followers gathered under the guise of sacred communion. To the uninitiated, the chapel above remained a symbol of salvation, its whitewashed walls and tolling bell a comforting constant. But below, in the flickering dark, Harrow was weaving a tapestry of devotion and dread, luring families into a web from which there was no escape. The basement's transformation was gradual but deliberate. Harrow, with his inner circle of the elect, oversaw its preparation. The damp cavern space, accessible only through a trapdoor behind the altar, was swept clean of cobwebs and debris by Amos Reed, the chapel's caretaker. Though his hands trembled as he worked, Harrow instructed the elect to bring in heavy wooden benches, arranged in a circle around a crude stone slab that had been dragged from a nearby quarry. The slab, rough and stained with lichen, was placed at the room's center, its purpose unspoken but ominous. Blackened lanterns, their glass smoked to dim the light, were hung from iron hooks, driven into the walls. Strange symbols, spirals, crosses with broken arms and shapes that seemed to writhe when glimpsed from the corner of the eye, were scratched into the stone, their origins unknown to all but Harrow. Amos, who had once grumbled about the mason's dampness, now avoided it entirely, claiming the air felt thick with eyes. When pressed, he would say no more, his silence bought by fear or something worse. Harrow's midnight gatherings began in secret, announced only to the elect. These were not the open services of Sunday mornings, but private rites, held when the town slept and the moon hung low. Families were invited under the pretense of exclusive blessings, their selection framed as a divine honor. Samuel Carter, now a fervent disciple, brought his wife Mary and their 2 sons, believing they were chosen for a higher purpose. Eliza Wilson, the young girl whose piety had turned feverish under Harrow's influence, attended with her parents, her eyes gleaming with a strange intensity. The Thompsons, desperate after another failed harvest, joined in hopes of divine favor. Each family was sworn to secrecy, told that the rituals were sacred, meant only for those who had proven their faith. To speak of them outside the basement was to invite God's wrath, Harrow warned, his voice soft but edged with steel. The rituals themselves were a descent into the uncanny. The trapdoor would creak open, and the chosen would descend the narrow stone staircase, their candles casting jittery shadows on the walls. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of earth, and something sharper, like rust or blood. Harrow stood at the slab, dressed in a black robe that seemed to absorb the light, his Bible open but unread. The elect would sit on the benches, their faces pale in the dim glow of the lantern. The chanting began softly, a low hum that grew into a rhythmic cadence, words that sounded like Latin, but twisted into something older, stranger. Harrow spoke of a God who demanded not just prayer but offering, a deity whose love was fierce and required The families, caught in the spell of his voice, nodded, their doubts drowned by the weight of the moment. Some later recalled feeling a chill, as if the basement itself were alive, its walls listening. The rituals grew darker with each passing month. At first, they involved only prayers and vows, pledges of loyalty to Harrow's vision of salvation. But soon, Harrow introduced new elements. A chalice, its rim stained with a dark residue, was passed among the elect, its contents bitter and metallic. No one dared ask what it was, though some, like Mary Carter, felt their stomachs churn after drinking. Small animals, rabbits, chickens, once a lamb, were brought to the slab, their throats cut with a silver knife. Harrow produced from his robe. The blood was collected in a bowl, smeared on the stone or used to trace symbols on the participants' foreheads. Harrow called these acts consecrations, necessary to purify the elect for the coming rebirth. The families, bound by fear and awe, complied, their faith in Harrow overriding their horror. Eliza Wilson, now his most devoted follower, was often seen at his side, her hands stained red, her expression vacant yet exultant. The basement became a place of transformation, not just for the space but for those who entered it. The elect returned to their daily lives changed, their eyes carrying a haunted intensity. Samuel Carter, once a pragmatic farmer, spoke of visions he'd seen in the basement, of a light that promised eternity. Eliza Wilson stopped attending school, spending her days copying Harrow's cryptic verses onto scraps of paper. The Thompsons, who had joined seeking relief from poverty, grew secretive, shunning neighbors who asked too many questions. The town noticed the shift, though few could pinpoint its cause. Whispers spread of strange lights in the chapel at night, of muffled chants heard through the floorboards. Those who dared approach Harrow with concerns, like Thomas Burke the blacksmith, who had already lost his forge, found themselves ostracized, or worse. Burke's cousin, a young man named Caleb, vanished after confronting Harrow, his coat found snagged on a thorn bush near the churchyard. Harrow's control over the elect was absolute, but it was built on a fragile foundation of fear and manipulation. He preyed on their vulnerabilities, exploiting their faith and their desperation. To the Carters, he promised divine protection for their sons, who had fallen ill the previous winter. To the Wilsons, he offered a path to glory for their daughter, casting her as a vessel for God's will. To the Thompsons, he dangled the hope of prosperity, claiming their sacrifices would bring abundance. Each promise was laced with a threat. To falter was to betray not just Harrow, but the God he served. The basement, with its oppressive air and blood-stained slab, became a crucible, where doubt was burned away, leaving only obedience. The elect were no longer just parishioners, they were initiates in a cult that masqueraded as Christianity, their souls tethered to Harrow's will. The town outside the basement remained oblivious, though unease was growing. The disappearances, Jonah Hale, Abigail Morse, now Caleb Burke, were harder to dismiss. Families stopped attending Sunday services, fearful of Harrow's piercing gaze. Others, drawn by his charisma, filled the pews, their numbers swelling as he preached of a coming judgment. The chapel, once a place of unity, was now a battleground of faith and fear. The basement rituals, known only to the elect, cast a shadow over Millhaven, a darkness that deepened with each midnight gathering. Harrow's plans were moving toward a climax, his sermons hinting at a great offering that would seal the town's fate. The stone slab waited, its stains growing darker, as the preacher prepared his flock for a sacrifice that would demand more than blood. Millhaven, caught in the grip of a man who spoke with the voice of God but served something far older, was hurtling toward a reckoning it could not foresee. By the winter of 1882, Millhaven was a town teetering on the edge of an abyss, its people divided between those enthralled by Ezekiel Harrow's fervent sermons, and those haunted by the growing shadow he cast. The air in the small Virginia community was thick with unease, the once warm glow of Augustine's chapel, now tainted by whispers of midnight gatherings and unexplained absences. As Christmas Eve approached, the town prepared for the holiday with a subdued fervor, stringing garlands and lighting candles, but the festive spirit was undercut by a creeping dread. Harrow, now revered as a prophet by his elect and feared by those who sensed his darkness, had spent months preparing for what he called the Great Offering. The church basement, transformed into a profane altar, was ready to host its most horrific ritual yet, a midnight mass that would become Millhaven's darkest hour. The night of December 24, 1882, was bitterly cold, the sky a starless void above snow-dusted fields. The Blue Ridge Mountains loomed in the distance, their silhouettes like silent sentinels, over a town unaware of the horror unfolding in its heart.
St. Augustine's chapel stood adorned with wreaths, its iron bell tolling midnight to summon the faithful. Harrow had announced a special holiday service, a sacred rite to honor Christ's birth, reserved for the most devoted families. 12 households, 43 souls in total, were invited, each believing they had been chosen for a divine honor. The Carters, with their 2 sons bundled in woolen coats, arrived with a mix of pride and apprehension. The Wilsons, led by their daughter Eliza, now a fervent disciple of Harrow, carried candles with trembling hands. The Thompsons, gaunt from hunger but clinging to hope, joined the procession, as did other families, the Millers, the Greys, the Hendersons, and more, all drawn by Harrow's promises of salvation. They gathered in the churchyard, their breath visible in the frosty air, and followed the preacher's beckoning hand toward the trapdoor behind the altar. The descent into the basement was a solemn procession, each family clutching a candle provided by the elect. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing the narrow stone staircase that led into the dark. The air grew colder as they descended, the scent of earth and mildew mingling with something sharper, like copper or decay. The basement was lit by blackened lanterns, their smoked glass casting a dim, unsteady glow that made the stone walls seem to pulse. The crude stone slab at the center, now polished to a dull sheen, was surrounded by the wooden benches where the elect had sat during earlier ritual. Strange symbols, etched deeper into the walls since the summer, caught the flickering light, their shapes twisting like living things. Harrow stood at the slab, his black robe blending into the shadows, his face illuminated by a single candle that made his eyes gleam like polished obsidian. The families, unaware of the true nature of the rite, took their places on the benches, their voices rising in a hesitant hymn. As the heavy oak door above was bolted shut, Harrow's voice cut through the hymn, sharp and commanding. He spoke of a God who demanded ultimate devotion, a deity whose love was forged in sacrifice. Tonight, he intoned, we offer ourselves wholly, that we may be reborn in his light. The words, familiar to the elect but new to the others, stirred a mix of awe and confusion. Eliza Wilson, seated closest to Harrow, began a low chant, her voice joined by other members of the elect, Samuel Carter, his eldest son, and a handful of others, who had been fully indoctrinated. The chant was guttural, its cadence alien to the hymns of the chapel above, and it sent a chill through the uninitiated. The candles flickered as if stirred by an unseen wind, and the air grew heavier, pressing against the lungs of those who still clung to their faith in a benevolent. Mary Carter, clutching her youngest son's hand, felt a pang of doubt but silenced it, trusting in her husband's devotion to Harrow. The ritual began with deceptive calm. Harrow raised a chalice, its rim crusted with dark stains, and passed it among the families, urging them to drink as a sign of their commitment. The liquid was bitter, thick with a metallic tang, and some gagged but swallowed under Harrow's piercing gaze. The Thompsons, their faces drawn, drank deeply, hoping for the prosperity Harrow had promised. The children, uneasy but obedient, sipped at their parents' urging. The chalice's contents dulled their senses, a subtle poison that left them pliant, their limbs heavy. Harrow's voice rose, weaving scripture with his own apocalyptic visions, speaking of a new kingdom where the elect would reign. The chanting grew louder, the elect's voices drowning out the nervous whispers of the other. The lanterns dimmed further, casting the basement into a twilight, where shapes blurred and fear took root. Then the true purpose of the night revealed itself. Harrow signaled to the elect, who rose from their benches with practiced precision. Ropes, hidden beneath the slab, were produced, their coarse fibers stained from prior use. The families, slowed by the chalice's contents, were too late to resist as the elect moved among them, binding wrists and ankles. Panic erupted, but it was muted, the drugged congregants struggling weakly against their captors. Mary Carter screamed as her sons were pulled from her, her voice lost in the chant. The Wilsons, fully committed to Harrow's cause, helped restrain their neighbors, their faces blank with zeal. The children, some as young as 6, were bound together, their cries muffled by cloth soaked in the same bitter liquid. Harrow stood unmoved, his hands raised as if conducting a symphony, his voice rising above the chaos. Through blood we are reborn. Through sacrifice we are saved. The stone slab became the focal point, its surface gleaming under the lantern's feeble light. One by one the families were led to it, their fates sealed by the ropes and the elect's unwavering loyalty. Harrow produced a silver knife, its blade etched with the same symbols that adorned the walls. He spoke of each offering as a gift to his God, his words a twisted mockery of the Christmas story above. The basement, once a place of storage, was now a charnel house in waiting, its walls ready to drink the blood of Millhaven's faithful. The tolling of the chapel bell, faint through the floorboards, marked the midnight hour, but it was no longer a call to worship, it was a knell for the doom. As the first family was dragged to the slab, the basement's shadows seemed to thicken, as if the darkness itself were feeding on the horror to come. Harrow's great offering had begun, and Millhaven would never be the same.
The midnight mass of Christmas Eve, 1882, in the basement of St. Augustine's Chapel descended into a nightmare that would forever scar Millhaven's soul. The air, already thick with the stench of earth and the bitter residue of the chalice's poison, grew heavy with the metallic tang of blood. The stone slab at the center of the basement, illuminated by the flickering glow of blackened lanterns, was no longer a mere altar, but a butcher's block, its surface slick with the offerings of Ezekiel Harrow's twisted faith. The 12 families, 43 men, women and children, bound by ropes and dulled by the drugged drink, were led one by one to their doom, their muffled cries swallowed by the relentless chanting of the elect. Harrow, standing tall in his black robe, his silver knife gleaming with profane purpose, orchestrated the slaughter with a fervor that seemed to draw strength from the chaos, his voice a fevered hymn to a god no scripture knew. The ritual unfolded with a grotesque precision, each act a step in Harrow's vision of rebirth through blood. The Carters were the first, their status as pillars of the community making their sacrifice a symbolic cornerstone. Samuel Carter, once a devoted follower, was dragged to the slab, his wrists bound and his eyes wide with withdreal. His wife Mary screamed as the elect held her back, her sons sobbing in their restraints. Harrow's knife descended swift and unyielding, and Samuel's lifeblood spilled across the stone, pooling in the carved symbols that seemed to pulse with unnatural light. Mary was next, her pleas cut short as the blade found her throat, her body collapsing beside her husband's. Their sons, aged 10 and 14, were spared no mercy, their small frames trembling as they were lifted to the slab, their cries silenced in moments. The elect, led by Eliza Wilson, whose youthful devotion had turned to fanaticism, moved with mechanical efficiency, their faces blank as they bound and delivered each victim. The Wilsons followed, though Eliza's parents were spared the blade, their loyalty to Harrow earning them a place among the executioners. Eliza herself wielded a smaller knife, her hands steady as she assisted in the sacrifices, her eyes gleaming with a zeal that chilled even the most devout of the elect. The Thompsons, weakened by hunger and the chalice's poison, offered little resistance, their bodies crumpling to the floor as the slab drank their blood. Family after family, the Millers, the Grays, the Hendersons and others, met the same fate, their lives extinguished in a ritual that grew more frenzied with each passing minute. The basement echoed with the sounds of despair, the thud of bodies against stone, the wet rasp of the knife, and the relentless chanting that drowned out the screams. The air grew stifling, the scent of iron overwhelming, as the floor became a slick mire of blood and terror. Harrow's voice rose above the carnage, a beacon of madness in the flickering dark. "Through blood we are reborn," he cried, his words a twisted liturgy that spurred the elect to greater fervor. The symbols on the walls seemed to writhe, catching the light in ways that defied reason, as if the basement itself were alive, feeding on the slaughter. Children, bound together in trembling clusters, were the last to face the slab, their small voices rising in a pitiful chorus before being silenced. One boy, a 6-year-old named Daniel Gray, managed to slip his ropes in the chaos, crawling beneath a bench to hide. His eyes wide with horror, witnessed the unthinkable, neighbors turning on neighbors, parents sacrificing their own, and Harrow, his robe now stained crimson, standing as the conductor of this hellish orchestra. Daniel's survival would later become Millhaven's only window into the massacre, his whispered account a fragile thread of truth in a town desperate to forget. The elect, now fully complicit, worked with a chilling unity. Eliza Wilson, her hands red to the elbows, moved among the bound, her once innocent face a mask of devotion. Samuel Carter's eldest son, who had joined the elect months earlier, held his own brother down as the knife fell, his loyalty to Harrow overriding blood ties. The Thompsons' daughter, barely 12, was dragged to the slab by her own uncle, a recent convert to the cult. The basement, designed for storage, had become a charnel house, its walls bearing witness to a betrayal of faith and humanity.
The lanterns cast jagged shadows, making the scene a grotesque tableau, as if the darkness itself were complicit in the horror. Harrow, his eyes blazing with an otherworldly light, seemed to grow taller, his presence filling the space as he proclaimed each death a step toward salvation. As the final family was sacrificed, the chanting reached a crescendo, a guttural roar that shook the stone walls. The slab, now drenched, glistened under the lanterns, its carvings filled with blood that seemed to glow faintly before sinking into the stone. Harrow raised his hands, the silver knife dripping, and declared the great offering complete. The elect, exhausted but exultant, fell to their knees, their voices hoarse from chanting. The basement was a scene of unimaginable carnage, bodies piled in corners, ropes tangled in pools of blood, and the air thick with the stench of death. The symbols on the walls, now smeared with crimson, seemed to pulse one final time before fading into stillness. Harrow, his robe heavy with gore, surveyed the scene with a satisfaction that bordered on divine. His mission fulfilled, or so he believed. The survivors, among the elect, were few, their minds shattered by what they had done. Eliza Wilson, still clutching her knife, stared at the slab as if seeing it for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. Others, like Samuel Carter's son, remained steadfast, their loyalty to Harrow unbroken. The boy beneath the bench, Daniel Gray, remained hidden, his small body trembling as he stifled his sobs. The trapdoor above remained bolted, the chapel silent, its bell no longer tolled.
The scars of the 1882 Christmas Eve massacre in Millhaven's St. Augustine's Chapel never faded, though the town did its best to bury them. By 1883, the chapel stood abandoned, its whitewashed walls peeling, its iron bell rusted silent, and its trapdoor sealed beneath heavy planks. The mass grave on the town's outskirts, where 43 souls were interred without ceremony, became a place of dread, avoided even by children daring each other to brave the dark. Millhaven itself withered, its population dwindling as families fled the memories of blood and betrayal. Those who remained spoke little of the horror, their silence a pact to protect what little community survived. Yet, the basement of Augustine's refused to be forgotten, its legacy seeping into the town like a poison, manifesting in whispers, shadows, and a lingering sense that the evil unleashed that night had never truly left. The ruins of the chapel, overtaken by vines and weather, became a focal point for tales of the supernatural. Locals swore they heard faint hymns drifting from the churchyard at midnight, their melodies warped as if sung by voices not entirely human. Farmers passing the site at dusk reported seeing lights flicker in the boarded windows, though no one dared investigate. By the early 20th century, the story of Ezekiel Harrow and his cult had solidified into legend, passed down in hushed tones around hearth. Old-timers recounted Daniel Gray's account, the sole survivor's tale of the blood-soaked slab and the preacher's silver knife, though many dismissed it as the ravings of a traumatized child. Daniel himself, raised by relatives in a neighboring county, never returned to Millhaven, but his nightmares followed him, and he died young, his health broken by the weight of what he had seen. In the decades that followed, the chapel's ruins drew curiosity from beyond Mill. By the 1970s, paranormal investigators began to visit, armed with tape recorders and early infrared cameras, seeking evidence of the restless dead. They reported chilling phenomena, sudden drops in temperature, even in summer, that left frost on their breath, disembodied whispers that seemed to come from beneath the ground, and fleeting shadows that moved against the logic of light. One investigator, a folklorist named Margaret Klein, claimed to have recorded a child's voice crying, "He's still here," though the tape mysteriously degraded before it could be studied. Others described feelings of suffocation near the sealed trapdoor, as if the basement's air still carried the weight of its horrors. Photographs taken inside the ruins often showed strange orbs or streaks of light, and some claimed to see figures in the corners of their images, gaunt shapes in black robes, their faces obscured. The symbols etched into the basement walls, glimpsed by Sheriff Ward and his deputies in 1882, became a point of obsession for occult scholars. Those who studied the massacre, piecing together fragments from Daniel's testimony and rare surviving documents, speculated that the carvings were not Christian, but tied to older, esoteric tradition. Some linked them to forgotten rituals of blood sacrifice, predating the chapel by centuries, though no definitive connection was ever proven. Artifacts recovered from the site: a rusted knife, a tattered hymnal with pages scrawled in unknown script, a shard of bone stained with dark residue were kept in private collections, deemed too unsettling for public display. A local historian, Clara Evans, attempted to compile a record of the massacre in the 1990s, but her work was met with resistance. Her home was vandalized, her notes stolen, and she abandoned the project, claiming something didn't want the truth told. Millhaven's residents, those few who stayed, maintained a code of silence, even as the legend grew. The town's economy, once sustained by farming, collapsed as the land seemed to turn barren, crops failing with unnatural frequency. Some whispered that the blood spilled in the basement had cursed the soil, a notion dismissed by outsiders, but clung to by those who felt the town's decay. The chapel itself was never demolished, though proposals were made. Each attempt met with strange setbacks: equipment failures, sudden illnesses among workers, or unexplained accidents. By the 21st century, the ruins were a crumbling shell. The roof caved in, but the foundation remained, as if the earth refused to reclaim. The trapdoor, still nailed shut, was said to creak on windless nights, though no one dared lift the planks to see what lay beneath. Paranormal activity peaked around the anniversary of the massacre. Every December, locals reported hearing the faint tolling of a bell, though the chapels had been removed decades ago. Children too young to know the full story spoke of sad voices in the churchyard, their descriptions eerily matching those of the sacrificed family. In 2015, a group of amateur investigators broke into the ruins, prying open the trapdoor against local warnings. They fled hours later, claiming the basement was wrong, the air too thick, the walls seeming to close in. One, a skeptic named Thomas Reed, later swore he saw a figure in a black robe standing by the slab, its eyes glowing like embers. Their equipment failed, their recordings corrupted, and none returned to Millhaven. The incident only deepened the site's infamy, drawing thrill-seekers and ghost hunters, though most left shaken, their bravado undone by an oppressive presence they couldn't explain. The legend of Ezekiel Harrow endured, his name synonymous with evil in Millhaven's folklore. Some believed he had died in the mountains, others that he had moved on to sow his darkness elsewhere. Rumors persisted of sightings: a gaunt man in black, seen in distant towns, always near a church, always gone by morning. The fate of the elect who fled with him, including Eliza Wilson, remained a mystery. Their names were erased from records, their homes left to rot. Some speculated they had formed a new cult, carrying Harrow's teachings into the shadows, though no evidence ever surfaced. The mass grave, unmarked and overgrown, was said to hew with unease, as if the dead refused to rest. Visitors who lingered too long reported dizziness, nausea, or dreams of blood and chanting, symptoms that faded only when they left Millhaven behind. Today, Augustine's chapel is a relic of Virginia's darkest history, its story a cautionary tale of faith, twisted into fanaticism. The town of Millhaven is little more than a ghost itself, its population a fraction of what it was, its fields foul. The chapel's ruins, shrouded in ivy and mist, stand as a monument to the massacre, a place where the past refuses to be buried. Paranormal investigators continue to visit, their findings adding to the lore: EVPs capturing faint screams, thermal images showing cold spots in the shape of huddled figures, and EMF spikes near the sealed trapdoor. Locals avoid the site, crossing themselves when they pass, and warn outsiders to stay away. The cries of children, the tolling of a phantom bell, and the shadow of Ezekiel Harrow linger, a haunting legacy that ensures the church basement massacre will never be forgotten, its echoes ringing through the hills of Virginia, as eternal as the blood that stained the stone. The snow fell silently over Eldermore, Virginia in the days following Christmas Eve, 1882, blanketing the town in a deceptive calm. St. Augustine's chapel stood abandoned, its doors locked, its steeple a mute witness to the horrors that had unfolded beneath its floorboard. When the sheriff and his men finally broke into the basement on December 27, driven by the desperate pleas of a relative who hadn't seen their kin since the midnight mass, they were met with a scene that would haunt their nightmares. The air was thick with the stench of blood, the dirt floor a crimson mire, and the bodies of 37 souls lay scattered, some slumped against the walls, others sprawled near the stone slab that had served as Ezekiel Harrow's altar. The symbols, smeared in blood and ash, seemed to leer from the walls, and the surviving children, found bound and shivering, could only whisper fragments of the nightmare they had endured. Harrow was gone,
vanished through a hidden tunnel, leaving behind a town shattered by his betrayal. The authorities, overwhelmed by the scale of the massacre, buried the truth as quickly as they buried the bodies. Official reports spoke of a tragic accident, a fire that never happened, to spare Eldamore the shame and panic of acknowledging the cult that had festered in its heart. The chapel was sealed, its basement entrance boarded up, and the townsfolk were left to grapple with their grief in silence. Those who survived carried the weight of that night forever. Some, like young Jacob Hawthorne, who had refused to attend, became recluses, haunted by guilt for not doing more to stop Harrow. Others, like the few children spared from the slab, left Eldamore, their memories fragmented but their nightmares vivid. The town itself withered, its population dwindling, as families fled, unable to live in the shadow of the chapel's ruins. Today the site of Augustine's is little more than a crumbling foundation, overtaken by vines and time, yet the legend of the church basement massacre endures, whispered in Virginia's backroads and ghost stories. Paranormal investigators who visit the ruins report strange phenomena, faint hymns echoing at midnight, cold spots that chill the bone, and the distant cries of children trapped in the earth. Locals avoid the place, claiming the ground itself feels cursed, as if the blood spilled that night still lingers, feeding something unseen. Ezekiel Harrow was never found, his name a curse in Eldamore, though some say he fled to the mountains, continuing his dark ministry in Forgotten Hollow. Others believe he was never fully human, a vessel for the veiled Lord he worshipped, still watching from the shadow. Whatever the truth, the massacre remains one of Virginia's darkest secrets, a wound that refuses to heal, its echoes a reminder of the fragility of faith, and the horrors that can hide behind a preacher's smile.